Section 13 of Manners, Customs and Dress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Manners, Customs and Dress during the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance period by Paul Lacroix. Section 13. The kitchen, soups, broths and stews, etc. The French word potage must originally have signified a soup composed of vegetables and herbs from the kitchen garden, but from the remotest times it was applied to soups in general. As the Gauls, according to Athenaeus, generally ate their meat boiled, we must presume that they made soup with the water in which it was cooked. It is related that one day Gregory of Tours was sitting at the table of King Chilperic, when the latter offered him a soup specially made in his honour from chicken. The poems of the 12th and 13th centuries mention soups made of peas, of bacon, of vegetables, and of groats. In the southern provinces there were soups made of almonds and of olive oil. When Du Guesclin went out to fight the English knight William of Blangbourg in single combat, he first ate 3 sorts of soup made with wine, "in honour of the 3 persons in the Holy Trinity." We find in the Ménagier, amongst a long list of the common soups the receipts for which are given, soup made of dried peas and the water in which bacon has been boiled, and in Lent, salted whale water, watercress soup, cabbage soup, cheese soup, and gramose soup, which was prepared by adding stewed meat to the water in which meat had already been boiled, and adding beaten eggs and verjuice. And lastly, the soupe dépourvue, which was rapidly made at the hotels for unexpected travellers, and was a sort of soup made from the odds and ends of the larder. In those days there is no doubt but that hot soup formed an indispensable part of the daily meals, and that each person took it at least twice a day, according to the old proverb, soupe la soir, soupe le matin, c'est l'ordinaire du bon chrétien. Soup in the evening and soup in the morning is the everyday food of a good Christian. The cooking apparatus of that period consisted of a whole glittering array of cauldrons, saucepans, kettles, and vessels of red and yellow copper, which hardly sufficed for all the rich soups for which France was so famous. Thence the old proverb, "En France sont les grands soupiers." But besides these soups, which were in fact looked upon as "common and without spice," a number of dishes were served under the generic name of soup, which constituted the principal luxuries at the great tables in the 14th century, but which do not altogether bear out the names under which we find them. For instance, there was haricot mutton, a sort of stew, thin chicken broth, veal broth with herbs, soup made of veal, roe, stag, wild boar, pork, hare, and rabbit soup flavoured with green peas, etc. The greater number of these soups were very rich, very expensive, several being served at the same time, and in order to please the eye as well as the taste, they were generally made of various colours, sweetened with sugar, and sprinkled with pomegranate seeds and aromatic herbs, such as marjoram, sage, thyme, sweet basil, savoury, etc. These descriptions of soups were perfect luxuries, and were taken instead of sweets. As a proof of this, we must refer to the famous soupe dorée, the description of which is given by Taillevent, head cook of Charles VII., in the following words: "Toast slices of bread, throw them into a jelly made of sugar, white wine, yolk of egg, and rose water. When they are well soaked, fry them, then throw them again into the rose water, and sprinkle them with sugar and saffron." It is possible that even now this kind of soup might find some favour, but we cannot say the same for those made with mustard, hemp seed, millet, verjuice, and a number of others much in repute at that period. For we see in Rabelais that the French were the greatest soup eaters in the world, and boasted to be the inventors of 70 sorts. We have already remarked that broths were in use at the remotest periods, for, from the time that the practice of boiling various meats was first adopted, it must have been discovered that the water in which they were so boiled became savoury and nourishing. In the time of the great King Francis I, says Noël du Fail, in his Conte de Trapel, in many places the saucepan was put on to the table, on which there was only one other large dish, of beef, mutton, veal, and bacon, garnished with a large bunch of cooked herbs, the whole of which mixture composed a porridge, and a real restorer and elixir of life. From this came the adage, "The soup in the great pot, and the dainties in the hotch-potch." At one time they made what they imagined to be strengthening broths for invalids, though their virtue must have been somewhat delusive, for, after having boiled down various materials in a close kettle and at a slow fire, they then distilled from this, and the water thus obtained was administered as a sovereign remedy. The common sense of Bernard Palissy did not fail to make him see this absurdity, and to protest against this ridiculous custom. "Take a capon," he says, "a partridge, or anything else, cook it well, and then if you smell the broth you will find it very good, and if you taste it you will find it has plenty of flavour, so much so that you will feel that it contains something to invigorate you. Distill this, on the contrary, and take the water then collected, and taste it, and you will find it insipid, and without smell except that of burning. This should convince you that your restorer does not give that nourishment to the weak body for which you recommend it as a means of making good blood, and restoring and strengthening the spirits." The taste for broths made of flour was formerly almost universal in France, and over the whole of Europe. It is spoken of repeatedly in the histories and annals of monasteries, and we know that the Normans, who made it their principal nutriment, were surnamed bouilleurs. They were, indeed, almost like the Romans, who in olden times, before their wars with Eastern nations, gave up making bread, and ate their corn simply boiled in water. In the 14th century the broths and soups were made with millet flour and mixed wheats. The pure wheat flour was steeped in milk seasoned with sugar, saffron, honey, sweet wine or aromatic herbs, and sometimes butter, fat, and yolks of eggs were added. It was on account of this that the bread of the ancients so much resembled cakes, and it was also from this fact that the art of the pastry cook took its rise. Wheat made into gruel for a long time was an important ingredient in cooking, being the basis of a famous preparation called fromentée, which was a bouillie of milk, made creamy by the addition of yolks of eggs, and which served as a liquor in which to roast meats and fish. There were, besides, several sorts of fromentée, all equally esteemed, and Taillevent recommended the following receipt, which differs from the one above given. "First boil your wheat in water, then put into it the juice or gravy of fat meat, or, if you like it better, milk of almonds, and by this means you will make a soup fit for fasts, because it dissolves slowly, is of slow digestion, and nourishes much. In this way, too, you can make ordia, or barley soup, which is more generally approved than the said fromentée." Semolina, vermicelli, macaroni, etc., which were called Italian, because they originally came from that country, have been in use in France longer than is generally supposed. They were first introduced after the expedition of Charles VIII. Into Italy and the conquest of the kingdom of Naples, that is, in the reign of Louis XII., or the first years of the 16th century. Pies, stews, roasts, salads, etc. Pastry made with fat, which might be supposed to have been the invention of modern kitchens, was in great repute amongst our ancestors. The manufacture of sweet and savoury pastry was entrusted to the care of the good ménagier of all ranks and conditions, and to the corporation of pastrycooks, who obtained their statutes only in the middle of the 16th century. The united skill of these, both in Paris and in the provinces, multiplied the different sorts of tarts and meat pies to a very great extent. So much was this the case, that these ingenious productions became a special art, worthy of rivalling even cookery itself. One of the earliest known receipts for making pies is that of Gas de la Bigne, first chaplain of Kings John, Charles V., and Charles VI. We find it in a sporting poem, and it deserves to be quoted verbatim as a record of the royal kitchen of the 14th century. It will be observed on perusing it that nothing was spared either in pastry or in cookery, and that expense was not considered when it was a question of satisfying the appetite. Trois perdriots gros et refaits au milieu du pâté me mets. Mais garde bien que tu ne failles à moi prendre si grosse caille, de quoi tu les appuieras. Et puis après tu me prendras une douzaine d'alouettes, qu'environ les cailles me mettent, et puis prendras de ces mâchés et de ces petits oiselets. Selon ce que tu en auras, le pâté m'embêtera. Or te faut faire provenance d'un peu de lard, sans point de rance, que tu tailleras comme dés. C'en sera le pasté poudré. Si tu le veux de bonne guise, du vertu la grappe y soit mise, d'un bien peu de sel soit poudré. Fais mettre des œufs en la paste, les croûtes un peu rudement faites de fleur de pur froment. Ni mets épices ni fromage, au four bien à point chaud le mets, qui de cendre est l'âtre bien né. Et qu'on sera bien à point cuit, il n'est si bon manger, ce cuit. Put me in the middle of the pie 3 young partridges, large and fat, but take good care not to fail to take 6 fine quail to put by their side. After that you must take a dozen skylarks, which round the quail you must place. And then you must take some thrushes and such other little birds as you can get to garnish the pie. Further, you must provide yourself with a little bacon, which must not be in the least rank, (reesty), and you must cut it into pieces of the size of a die, and sprinkle them into the pie. If you want it to be in quite good form, you must put some sour grapes in, and a very little salt. Have eggs put into the paste, and the crust made rather hard of the flour of pure wheat. Put in neither spice nor cheese. Put it into the oven just at the proper heat, the bottom of which must be quite free from ashes, and when it is baked enough, isn't that a dish to feast on? From this period all treatises on cookery are full of the same kind of receipts for making "pies of young chickens, of fresh venison, of veal, of eels, of bream and salmon, of young rabbits, of pigeons, of small birds, of geese, and of narrois," a mixture of cod's liver and hashed fish. We may mention also the small pies, which were made of minced beef and raisins, similar to our mince pies, and which were hawked in the streets of Paris until their sale was forbidden, because the trade encouraged greediness on the one hand and laziness on the other. ancient pastries, owing to their shapes, received the name of tourte or tarte, from the Latin torta, a large hunch of bread. This name was afterwards exclusively used for hot pies, whether they contained vegetables, meat, or fish. But towards the end of the 14th century, tourte and tarte was applied to pastry containing herbs, fruits, or preserves, and pâté to those containing any kind of meat, game, or fish. It was only in the course of the 16th century that the name of potage ceased to be applied to stews, whose number equalled their variety, for on a bill of fare of a banquet of that period we find more than 50 different sorts of potage mentioned. The greater number of these dishes have disappeared from our books on cookery, having gone out of fashion. But there are two stews which were popular during many centuries, and which have maintained their reputation, although they do not now exactly represent what they formerly did. The pot pourri, which was composed of veal, beef, mutton, bacon, and vegetables, and the galimafré, a fricassee of poultry, sprinkled with verjuice, flavoured with spices, and surrounded by a sauce composed of vinegar, breadcrumbs, cinnamon, ginger, etc. The highest aim of the cooks of the Taillevent school was to make dishes not only palatable, but also pleasing to the eye. These masters in the art of cooking might be said to be both sculptors and painters, so much did they decorate their works, their object being to surprise or amuse the guests by concealing the real nature of the dishes. Froissart, speaking of a repast given in his time, says that there were a number of "dishes so curious and disguised that it was impossible to guess what they were." For instance, the bill of fare above referred to mentions a lion and a sun made of white chicken, a pink jelly with diamond-shaped points. And as if the object of cookery was to disguise food and deceive epicures, Taillevent facetiously gives us a receipt for making fried or roast butter, and for cooking eggs on the spit. The roasts were as numerous as the stews. A treatise of the 14th century names about 30, beginning with a sirloin of beef, which must have been one of the most common, and ending with a swan, which appeared on table in full plumage. This last was the triumph of cookery, inasmuch as it presented this magnificent bird to the eyes of the astonished guests, just as if he were living and swimming. His beak was gilt, his body silvered, resting on a mass of brown pastry painted green in order to represent a grass field. 8 banners of silk were placed round, and a cloth of the same material served as a carpet for the whole dish, which towered above the other appointments of the table. The peacock, which was as much thought of then as it is little valued now, was similarly arrayed, and was brought to table amidst a flourish of trumpets and the applause of all present. The modes of preparing other roasts much resembled the present system in their simplicity, with this difference, that strong meats were first boiled to render them tender, and no roast was ever handed over to the skill of the carver without first being thoroughly basted with orange juice and rose water, and covered with sugar and powdered spices. We must not forget to mention the broiled dishes, the invention of which is attributed to hunters, and which Rabelais continually refers to as acting as stimulants, and irresistibly exciting the thirst for wine at the sumptuous feasts of those voracious heroes. The custom of introducing salads after roasts was already established in the 15th century. However, a salad, of whatever sort, was never brought to table in its natural state, for besides the raw herbs, dressed in the same manner as in our days, it contained several mixtures, such as cooked vegetables, and the crests, livers, or brains of poultry. After the salads, fish was served, sometimes fried, sometimes sliced with eggs or reduced to a sort of pulp, which was called carpe or charpie. and sometimes it was boiled in water or wine, with strong seasoning. Near the salads, in the course of the dinner, dishes of eggs, prepared in various ways, were generally served. Many of these are now in use, such as the poached egg, the hard-boiled egg, egg sauce, etc. Seasonings. We have already stated that the taste for spices much increased in Europe after the Crusades, and in this rapid historical sketch of the food of the French people in the Middle Ages, it must have been observed to what an extent this taste had become developed in France. This was the origin of sauces, all, or almost all, of which were highly spiced, and were generally used with boiled, roast, or grilled meats. A few of these sauces, such as the yellow, the green, and the cameline, became so necessary in cooking that numerous persons took to manufacturing them by wholesale, and they were hawked in the streets of Paris. These sauce criers were first called sauciers, then vinaigriers moustardiers, and when Louis XII. United them in a body, as their business had considerably increased, they were termed sauciers moutardiers vinaigriers, distillers of brandy and spirits of wine, and buffetiers, from buffet, a sideboard. But very soon the corporation became divided, no doubt from the force of circumstances, and on one side we find the distillers, and on the other the master cooks and cooks, or porte-chape, as they were called, because, when they carried on their business of cooking, they covered their dishes with a chape, that is a cope or tin cover, so as to keep them warm. The list of sauces of the 14th century, given by the Ménagier de Paris, is most complicated. But on examining the receipts, it becomes clear that the variety of those preparations, intended to sharpen the appetite, resulted principally from the spicy ingredients with which they were flavoured. And it is here worthy of remark that pepper, in these days exclusively obtained from America, was known and generally used long before the time of Columbus. It is mentioned in a document of the time of Clotaire III, 660, and it is clear, therefore, that before the discovery of the New World, pepper and spices were imported into Europe from the East. Mustard, which was an ingredient in so many dishes, was cultivated and manufactured in the 13th century in the neighbourhood of Dijon and Angers. According to a popular adage, garlic was the medicine, thériaque, of peasants. Town people for a long time greatly appreciated aillé, which was a sauce made of garlic and sold ready prepared in the streets of Paris. The custom of using anchovies as a flavouring is also very ancient. This was also done with botargue and caviale, two sorts of side dishes, which consisted of fishes' eggs, chiefly mullet and sturgeon, properly salted or dried, and mixed with fresh or pickled olives. The olives for the use of the lower orders were brought from Languedoc and Provence, whereas those for the rich were imported from Spain and some from Syria. It was also from the south of France that the rest of the kingdom was supplied with olive oil, for which to this day those provinces have preserved their renown. But as early as the 12th and 13th centuries oil of walnuts was brought from the centre of France to Paris, and this, although cheaper, was superseded by oil extracted from the poppy. Truffles, though known and esteemed by the ancients, disappeared from the gastronomic collection of our forefathers. It was only in the 14th century that they were again introduced, but evidently without a knowledge of their culinary qualities, since, after being preserved in vinegar, they were soaked in hot water and afterwards served up in butter. We may also here mention sorrel and the common mushroom, which were used in cooking during the Middle Ages. On the strength of the old proverb, "Sugar has never spoiled sauce," sugar was put into all sauces which were not piquantes, and generally some perfumed water was added to them, such as rose water. This was made in great quantities by exposing to the sun a basin full of water, covered over by another basin of glass, under which was a little vase containing rose leaves. This rose water was added to all stews, pastries, and beverages. It is very doubtful as to the period at which white lump sugar became known in the West. However, in an account of the house of the Dauphin Viennois, 1333, mention is made of white sugar, and the author of the Ménagier de Paris frequently speaks of this white sugar, which before the discovery, or rather colonization, of America, was brought ready refined from the Grecian islands, and especially from Candia. Verjuice, or green juice, which with vinegar formed the essential basis of sauces, and is now extracted from a species of green grape which never ripens, was originally the juice of sorrel. Another sort was extracted by pounding the green blades of wheat. Vinegar was originally merely soured wine, as the word vin aigre denotes. The mode of manufacturing it by artificial means, in order to render the taste more pungent and the quality better, is very ancient. It is needless to state that it was scented by the infusion of herbs or flowers, roses, elder, cloves, etc. But it was not much before the 16th century that it was used for pickling herbs or fruits and vegetables, such as gherkins, onions, cucumber, purslane, etc. Salt, which from the remotest periods was the condiment par excellence, and the trade in which had been free up to the 14th century, became from that period the subject of repeated taxation. The levying of these taxes was a frequent cause of tumult amongst the people, who saw with marked displeasure the exigencies of the excise gradually raising the price of an article of primary necessity. We have already mentioned times during which the price of salt was so exorbitant that the rich alone could put it in their bread. Thus, in the reign of Francis I., it was almost as dear as Indian spices. Sweet dishes, desserts, etc. In the 14th century, the first courses of a repast were called mets or assiettes, the last entremets, dorures, issus de table, dessert, and boute hors. The dessert consisted generally of baked pears, medlars, peeled walnuts, figs, dates, peaches, grapes, filberts, spices, and white or red sugar plums. At the issue de table, wafers or some other light pastry were introduced, which were eaten with the hypocras wine. The boute hors, which was served when the guests, after having washed their hands and said grace, had passed into the drawing-room, consisted of spices different from those which had appeared at dessert, and intended specially to assist the digestion. And for this object they must have been much needed, considering that a repast lasted several hours. Whilst eating these spices, they drank grenache, malmsey, or aromatic wines. It was only at the banquets and great repasts that sweet dishes and dorures appeared, and they seem to have been introduced for the purpose of exhibiting the power of the imagination and the talent in execution of the master cook. The dorures consisted of jellies of all sorts and colours. Swans, peacocks, bitterns, and herons on gala feasts were served in full feather on a raised platform in the middle of the table, and hence the name of raised dishes. As for the side dishes, properly so called, the long list collected in the Ménagier shows us that they were served at table indiscriminately, for stuffed chickens at times followed hashed porpoise in sauce, lark pies succeeded lamb sausages, and pike's eggs fritters appeared after orange preserve. At a later period the luxury of side dishes consisted in the quantity and in the variety of the pastry. Rabelais names 16 different sorts at one repast. Taillevent mentions pastry called covered pastry, Bourbonnaise pastry, double-faced pastry, pear pastry, and apple pastry. Platina speaks of the white pastry, with quince, elderflowers, rice, roses, chestnuts, etc. The fashion of having pastry is, however, of very ancient date, for in the book of the Proverbs of the 13th century we find that the pies of Dourlens and the pastry of Chartres were then in great celebrity. In a charter of Robert le Bouillon, Bishop of Amiens, in 1311, mention is made of a cake composed of puff flaky paste. These cakes, however, are less ancient than the firm pastry called bean cake, or king's cake, which, from the earliest days of monarchy, appeared on all the tables, not only at the feast of the Epiphany, but also on every festive occasion. Amongst the dry and sweet pastries from the small oven which appeared at the issue de table, the first to be noticed were those made of almonds, nuts, etc., and such choice morsels, which were very expensive. Then came the cream or cheese cakes, the petits choux made of butter and eggs, the échaudés, of which the people were very fond, and Saint Louis even allowed the bakers to cook them on Sundays and feast days for the poor. Wafers, which are older than the 13th century, and lastly the oublis, which under the names of Nieul, Estéré, and Supplication gave rise to such an extensive trade that a corporation was established in Paris called the Oublayeurs, Oublayés or Oublieux, whose statutes directed that none should be admitted to exercise the trade unless he was able to make in one day 500 large oublis, 300 supplications, and 200 estérés. End of section 13.